This video is created for storytelling while the real names, locations, and identifying information have been changed to protect the privacy and dignity of the individuals and families involved. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the channel. If you're here late at night looking for a story to drift off to, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Long before the newspapers would give him a monstrous nickname, Adrian Marcus Hale was simply a quiet boy growing up in a narrow stone house on the outskirts of Bramford, England. The house stood behind a tall wooden fence that blocked the view of the road, as if the family inside wished to disappear from the rest of the world. Adrian's parents, Samuel and Lydia Hale, were deeply devoted members of a strict religious sect that believed the outside world was corrupt and dangerous. Samuel often preached that society was full of temptation and sin, and that isolation was the only protection from it. Because of this belief, Adrian lived a childhood unlike most others. He was rarely allowed to visit neighbors, rarely allowed to attend social gatherings, and almost never allowed to form friendships. The tall fence surrounding their property became a symbol of his upbringing. To outsiders, it was simply a boundary. To Adrian, it felt like a wall between himself and the rest of humanity. Most days were quiet and predictable. Adrian spent hours wandering the small garden behind the house, speaking only to a few animals he kept as companions. A pair of rabbits, a stray cat, and the neighbor's aging sheepdog were the closest things he had to friends. When he heard children laughing somewhere beyond the fence, he would pause and listen, wondering what it might be like to be part of that world. Inside the house, silence ruled. His parents believed entertainment encouraged moral weakness. There were no radios, no gatherings, and no stories of adventure. Yet despite those restrictions, Adrian developed an unexpected passion: music. When he was 10 years old, a small upright piano appeared in their living room. It had once belonged to a distant relative, and Samuel believed it could be used for church hymns. Adrian discovered it one quiet evening when the house was empty. He pressed a single key, and the note echoed through the room like a voice breaking years of silence. From that moment, the piano became his escape. He taught himself slowly, repeating melodies he heard at church and experimenting with harmonies until his fingers learned their own language. Music allowed him to feel something that his isolated childhood rarely provided: freedom. His talent did not go unnoticed. At 14, Adrian earned a scholarship to Kingsbridge Grammar School, a respected academy in the nearby city. For the first time in his life, he walked among other students his age. Teachers praised his intelligence, classmates admired his musical ability, and for a brief period, it seemed as though the lonely boy behind the fence might grow into a respected young man. But Adrian never quite learned how to belong. He watched people closely, studying their expressions, their laughter, their casual friendships. He could imitate their manners and their charm, but he never truly felt the same warmth they did. It was as if he were observing humanity from behind invisible glass. Still, he learned something valuable during those years: how to impress people. His calm voice, careful manners, and quiet confidence made him appear trustworthy. Teachers believed he was disciplined and thoughtful. Classmates assumed he was simply shy. Adrian realized that if he said the right words and behaved in the right way, people would accept almost anything he told them. That discovery would follow him for the rest of his life. Years later, in the summer of 1935, Adrian met a young woman named Clara Weston at a small gathering in Chelmsford. Clara was lively, outgoing, and known among her friends for her sense of humor and restless curiosity. Where Adrian was quiet and reserved, Clara was vibrant and spontaneous. Their personalities could not have been more different. But Adrian knew exactly how to present himself. He spoke politely, listened carefully, and played the piano for the guests that evening. Clara watched him with interest as his fingers moved across the keys, filling the room with elegant classical melodies. To her, he seemed mysterious and thoughtful. To Adrian, she seemed useful. Within weeks, the two were inseparable. Adrian showered Clara with attention and praise. He spoke about ambitious plans, future success, and opportunities waiting just beyond the horizon. Clara believed every word. When he proposed marriage, she accepted without hesitation. The wedding took place quietly that autumn. Friends described Adrian as charming and respectful, a man who seemed deeply devoted to his bride. But the truth behind the marriage began to unravel almost immediately. Adrian had secrets. He often disappeared for hours without explanation. Letters arrived to unfamiliar names, and most troubling of all, he had begun experimenting with questionable business schemes that promised quick money. Clara tried to ignore the warning signs, but 4 months after their marriage, police arrived at their home. Adrian had been forging vehicle ownership documents and selling cars that didn't legally belong to him. It was a small fraud by criminal standards, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. He was arrested and sentenced to prison. Clara was left alone, shocked and humiliated. Their marriage had barely begun before it collapsed into scandal. Not long afterward, she quietly left the city and cut off contact entirely. For Adrian, prison became something unexpected, a classroom. Behind the cold stone walls, he spent long hours reading about notorious criminals, fraud schemes, and historical cases that fascinated him. But one particular story caught his attention more than any other. It involved a French killer who had disposed of his victims using industrial acid. The idea haunted Adrian's thoughts. The method seemed almost impossible to trace. Bodies could disappear without leaving traditional evidence behind. No witnesses, no remains, just absence. Adrian began imagining the possibilities. He conducted crude experiments using small animals he found around the prison yard, carefully observing how quickly acid could dissolve organic matter. The results convinced him that the method worked exactly as described. More importantly, it revealed something else. If a body vanished completely, a murder could become almost impossible to prove. By the time Adrian was released several years later, the world had changed. War had reshaped cities, economies, and opportunities. But Adrian returned with the same ambition he had always carried. Only now, his ambitions had grown darker. In 1943, Adrian moved to London hoping to rebuild his life. At first, he worked ordinary jobs, accounting, chauffeur services, small business ventures. But the same problem followed him everywhere. He wanted wealth, and he wanted it quickly. One evening, while visiting a pub in Kensington, Adrian encountered a familiar face from years earlier. Thomas Whitaker, a cheerful property manager who had once employed him as a driver. Thomas greeted him warmly and introduced him to his elderly parents, Harold and Margaret Whitaker, who owned several rental properties throughout the city. They spoke proudly of their son's success managing the family's buildings. Adrian listened politely while jealousy quietly stirred inside him. That night, Adrian returned to his rented room with a new idea forming in his mind. A simple idea. If someone like Thomas Whitaker disappeared, someone else might step into his life. And in a quiet basement workshop on a narrow London street, Adrian Hale began preparing metal containers that could hold far more dangerous than ordinary storage. Barrels. Barrels large enough to hide a terrible secret. The first step of his plan was already forming, and soon, someone he once called a friend would unknowingly walk straight into it. By the autumn of 1944, Adrian Marcus Hale had quietly settled into a routine in London that, on the surface, appeared ordinary. He rented a modest room, kept his clothing neat, and spoke with the calm confidence of a man rebuilding his life after past mistakes. To the people who met him casually, Adrian seemed polite, educated, and even slightly reserved. But behind that carefully maintained image, he was planning something far darker. In a narrow basement workshop he rented on Ravenhurst Lane, Adrian had arranged several large metal drums against the wall. The containers were industrial oil barrels he had purchased through a scrap dealer, claiming he needed them for chemical storage related to an engineering experiment. No one questioned him. London was still recovering from the war, and unusual projects were common in the city's warehouses and basements. The drums were filled with concentrated industrial acid. Adrian had spent months studying the chemical's effects, remembering the experiments he had conducted years earlier. He knew exactly how powerful it was and how completely it could destroy organic material. To Adrian, the drums represented something more than chemistry. They represented a perfect crime. All he needed now was the right victim. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. One rainy evening, Adrian met Thomas Whitaker again at the Kensington pub where they had first reconnected months earlier. Thomas greeted him with the same warmth as before, unaware that Adrian had been carefully observing him ever since that night. Thomas trusted him. That trust would become fatal. During their conversation, Adrian mentioned that he had been working on a mechanical invention and had recently rented a small workshop to develop the idea further. Thomas, curious and supportive, expressed interest in seeing it. Adrian smiled politely. "Why not come by tomorrow evening?" he suggested. "I could use a second opinion." Thomas agreed without hesitation. The next night, the two men walked together along the dimly lit street leading to the basement entrance of Adrian's workshop. Inside, the room smelled faintly of chemicals and metal. The oil drums stood quietly against the wall, partially hidden behind wooden panels. Thomas glanced around curiously. "So this is your laboratory," he joked. Adrian nodded calmly. "It's only temporary," he replied. As Thomas stepped further into the room, Adrian quietly reached for the heavy iron pipe he had hidden behind the workbench. There was no warning. The first blow struck Thomas across the back of the head. He collapsed instantly onto the concrete floor. Adrian struck him again to be certain the job was finished. For a moment, the room was silent except for Adrian's steady breathing. Then he dragged the body toward one of the waiting drums. The lid opened with a metallic scrape. Inside, the thick acid moved slowly, almost lazily, reflecting the dim overhead light. Adrian pushed the body inside. The reaction began almost immediately. Satisfied that his plan was working exactly as expected, Adrian sealed the drum and left the workshop for the night. When he returned 2 days later, the contents had largely dissolved into a dark, unrecognizable liquid. There were no fingerprints left to wipe, no bloodstains to clean, no corpse to bury. Adrian carefully poured the remaining liquid into a nearby drainage channel that connected to the city's sewer system. Thomas Whitaker had vanished without a trace. In the days that followed, Adrian played his next role carefully. When Thomas's parents, Harold and Margaret Whitaker, began asking questions about their son's whereabouts, Adrian appeared concerned and helpful. He told them Thomas had recently mentioned traveling north to Scotland to avoid potential military obligations that still lingered from the war. The explanation seemed believable enough. But as weeks passed without a single letter or phone call from their son, Harold and Margaret began to grow anxious. Adrian offered comfort. He visited them frequently, bringing groceries and helping with paperwork related to their rental properties. The elderly couple appreciated his kindness. After all, Adrian had once worked for their son. They believed he was simply returning that loyalty. Gradually, Adrian became deeply involved in their affairs. He helped collect rent from tenants, he reviewed financial records, he even began managing small transactions on their behalf. The Whitakers trusted him completely. What they didn't realize was that Adrian had already decided their fate. If Thomas Whitaker's disappearance had been profitable, Adrian believed removing the elderly couple would allow him to control their entire estate. All he needed now was another opportunity. That opportunity arrived in July of 1945. Adrian visited Harold and Margaret with exciting news. He told them their son had finally returned to London, but was staying temporarily in a private apartment to avoid unwanted attention. He suggested arranging a surprise reunion. The elderly couple were overjoyed. Adrian offered to drive them to the location where Thomas was supposedly waiting. Instead, he took them to the same basement workshop on Ravenhurst Lane. The events that followed were swift and brutal. Once inside the room, Adrian struck Harold first, using the same iron pipe he had used months earlier. Margaret tried to scream, but he silenced her moments later. Within an hour, both bodies were sealed inside the acid drums. 2 days later, nothing recognizable remained. With the Whitaker family gone, Adrian began forging documents and signatures to gain control of their financial assets. He sold several of their properties and withdrew money from accounts that had once belonged to them. The total profit amounted to nearly £8,000, a small fortune at the time. Adrian moved into a comfortable apartment at the Ashbourne Court Hotel in South Kensington, presenting himself as a successful engineer working on various industrial projects. For a time, life seemed perfect. He dressed well, dined in elegant restaurants, and spent long evenings gambling in London's private clubs. To the people around him, Adrian Hale appeared to be a quiet man enjoying the rewards of his success. But money obtained quickly disappears just as quickly. By early 1947, his gambling losses had consumed most of the Whitaker fortune. Adrian once again faced the problem that had haunted him his entire life. He needed more money, and he knew exactly how to get it. Around this time, Adrian met Dr. Leonard Carrington and his wife Eleanor, a wealthy couple preparing to sell their townhouse. Adrian pretended to be interested in purchasing the property and quickly developed a friendly relationship with them. Dr. Carrington admired Adrian's intelligence, while Eleanor enjoyed his musical talent when he played piano during social gatherings. They believed they had met a charming and respectable gentleman. They had no idea they had invited a killer into their home. During one visit, Adrian quietly stole Dr. Carrington's revolver from a desk drawer. He knew the weapon would make his next crime far easier. Soon afterward, he invited the doctor to his workshop, claiming he had developed an innovative mechanical device that might interest him. Dr. Carrington accepted the invitation, just as Thomas Whitaker had done before him. Inside the workshop, Adrian greeted him warmly. As the doctor examined a workbench covered with tools and sketches, Adrian raised the revolver and fired a single shot into the back of his head. The sound echoed through the empty building. Later that evening, Adrian called Eleanor Carrington and told her that her husband had suddenly collapsed while visiting his workshop. He urged her to come quickly. When she arrived, Adrian shot her as well. Within hours, both bodies were inside the acid drums. This time, however, Adrian made a small mistake. He kept several of the Carringtons' belongings, including their car and their dog. It was a detail that seemed harmless at the time, but small details often become the first threads investigators begin to pull. And soon, another wealthy resident of Ashbourne Court Hotel would unknowingly step into Adrian Hale's life. A woman whose disappearance would finally unravel everything he had so carefully hidden. Her name was Margaret Devereux, and her curiosity about Adrian's mysterious workshop would bring the police closer than ever before to discovering the truth. By the beginning of 1949, Adrian Marcus Hale believed he had perfected his method. 4 people had vanished over the course of several years. No bodies had been found. No direct evidence had tied him to the disappearances. The acid in his workshop had erased almost every trace of what he had done. To the outside world, Adrian appeared to be a quiet and successful engineer living at the Ashbourne Court Hotel in South Kensington. He dressed well, spoke politely, and kept mostly to himself. Other residents considered him an intelligent but slightly reserved man. But behind that calm appearance, Adrian was running out of money again. His gambling habit had slowly consumed the fortune he stole from the Whittaker family and the Carringtons. The comfortable lifestyle he had created was expensive, and the hotel bills alone were beginning to pile up. Soon, he would need another victim. That victim appeared in the form of Margaret Devereux, a wealthy widow who also lived at the Ashbourne Court Hotel. Margaret was 69 years old and known among the residents as an energetic and talkative woman. Her late husband had been a successful solicitor, leaving her with a comfortable inheritance. She enjoyed discussing business ideas and inventions, often sharing imaginative concepts that she believed could make her fortune even larger. Adrian listened carefully whenever she spoke. One evening in the hotel lounge, Margaret excitedly described an idea she had for artificial fingernails made from a new synthetic material. She believed the invention could become extremely popular if someone could help her produce it. Adrian immediately saw an opportunity. He told her he had access to a private workshop where experimental manufacturing could take place. If she wanted, he could show her the space and discuss how the invention might be developed. Margaret was thrilled. Within days, the two arranged to meet at Adrian's workshop on Ravenhurst Lane. On the afternoon of February 18, 1949, Margaret arrived at the building carrying a small notebook filled with sketches of her idea. Adrian greeted her warmly and led her inside the dim basement room. The oil drum still stood against the wall, hidden behind wooden panels. Margaret noticed none of it. As she leaned over a workbench to explain her design, Adrian quietly stepped behind her with the revolver he had stolen months earlier. The gun fired once. Margaret collapsed instantly. For Adrian, the process had become almost routine. He stripped the valuables from her body, including an expensive Persian fur coat and several pieces of jewelry. Then he placed her body inside one of the acid drums and sealed the lid. The chemical reaction began immediately. To Adrian, the crime seemed as perfect as the others. But this time, something went wrong. The following morning at the Ashbourne Court Hotel, residents noticed that Margaret had not appeared for breakfast. It was unusual. Margaret was known for greeting the staff early each day, often discussing her latest ideas over tea. Her absence quickly became a topic of concern among the guests. Several people asked Adrian if he had seen her, since they knew the two had planned to meet the previous afternoon. Adrian calmly replied that Margaret had failed to show up for their meeting. He suggested she might have changed her plans at the last minute. At first, everyone accepted the explanation, but as another day passed with no sign of her, worry began to spread through the hotel. One of the guests, Mrs. Eleanor Lane, decided she would report Margaret missing to the police. When Adrian heard this, he offered to drive her to the station. The gesture seemed helpful and cooperative, but it would turn out to be his greatest mistake. At the Chelsea police station, Adrian calmly repeated the story he had told everyone else. He explained that Margaret had planned to meet him but never arrived. Sergeant Richard Latham, the officer taking the report, listened carefully. Something about Adrian's manner felt strange. He appeared calm, almost too calm. Latham decided to check Adrian's background through the police records office. The results arrived the following morning. Adrian Hale had a long history of fraud and deception, including several prison sentences under different business schemes. Now Latham was suspicious. Meanwhile, Adrian had returned to his workshop early that morning to finish disposing of Margaret's remains. The acid had almost completely dissolved her body, leaving only a thick chemical residue. Instead of draining the liquid properly, Adrian dumped part of the mixture behind the building. It was a careless decision, and it would soon cost him everything. That same afternoon, police officers arrived at the Ashbourne Court Hotel and asked Adrian to come with them for further questioning. He remained calm. He believed there was still no evidence connecting him to Margaret's disappearance. But while Adrian sat in an interview room, detectives searched his workshop on Ravenhurst Lane. Inside, they discovered several disturbing items: a rubber apron, a gas mask, empty acid containers, and a recently fired revolver. But the most shocking discovery was outside the building. Among the rubble where Adrian dumped the acid mixture, investigators found strange human remains. There were lumps of melted body fat, fragments of bone, and pieces of a denture that could later be traced to Margaret Devereux. The case against Adrian began forming quickly. When he was brought back for questioning, Detective Inspector Charles Webb confronted him with the evidence. At first, Adrian remained silent. Then he asked a strange question. "Tell me," he said quietly, "what are the chances of someone being released from Broadmoor?" Broadmoor was a high-security psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane. Inspector Webb replied that he couldn't answer such a question. Adrian leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Well," he said, "if I told you the truth, you might not believe it." Moments later, he confessed, not only to the murder of Margaret Devereux, but also to the killings of the Whittaker family and the Carringtons. He even claimed responsibility for several other murders, though those victims were never confirmed. After years of deception, Adrian Hale had finally revealed the truth. The trial began in July 1949 at the Lewiston Assizes Court. Adrian's defense centered around a shocking claim. He told the court he suffered from vampiric urges and had consumed the blood of his victims. He described recurring nightmares filled with visions of blood and claimed these hallucinations had driven him to kill. The story sounded bizarre and horrifying, but investigators believed it was nothing more than a desperate attempt to appear insane and avoid execution. The prosecution argued that Adrian's crimes had been carefully planned and financially motivated. Every murder had been committed to gain money or property from his victims. His actions were not madness, they were calculated. After hearing all the evidence, the jury needed only 15 minutes to reach their verdict: guilty. When the judge asked Adrian if he had anything to say before sentencing, he simply replied, "Nothing at all." The court sentenced him to death by hanging. Adrian spent his final weeks at Wexford Prison writing letters and giving interviews about his life. He spoke calmly about the murders, often describing them as though they were experiments rather than crimes. On the morning of August 10, 1949, Adrian Hale was led to the gallows by the prison executioner. Witnesses later said he remained completely composed until the very end. Moments later, the lever was pulled, and the man who dissolved his victims in acid finally met his own fate. The case shocked the public across England. Never before had a killer used such a strange and disturbing method to erase his crimes. Newspapers quickly labeled Adrian Hale the acid barrel murderer. Even decades later, the story remained one of the most chilling criminal cases in British history. Because what made Adrian Hale truly terrifying wasn't just the method he used, it was how ordinary he seemed. A polite man, a talented pianist, a neighbor you might trust, until the day he decided you were worth to him dead than alive.
On September 3rd, 1934, a baby boy was born in Redstone, Oklahoma, a quiet town surrounded by wheat fields and long stretches of empty highway. Within weeks of his birth, his biological mother placed him up for adoption. No one ever knew exactly why. Some believed she was too young to care for a child. Others believed she simply vanished and started a new life somewhere else. 3 months later, the infant was adopted by a couple named Harold and Evelyn Carter. They named him Nathaniel Carter. To neighbors and relatives, Evelyn appeared to be a devoted mother. She often spoke about Nathaniel as if he were the most extraordinary child in the world. She told friends that he would grow up to be someone remarkable, someone brilliant. But inside the Carter household, life was far stranger than anyone outside could imagine. Evelyn Carter was known for her strict and unusual parenting methods. She believed discipline created greatness, and she enforced her rules with unsettling intensity. When Nathaniel was still an infant, she once locked him alone in a dark room because he had chewed on one of her sewing tools. If he refused to sleep during nap time, she tied him to the bed with cloth straps so he couldn't move. When he refused to drink his milk, she punished him with harsh spankings. These punishments were often followed by affection and praise, leaving Nathaniel in a confusing world where comfort and fear lived side by side. But Evelyn's strangest behavior involved how she dressed her young son. For several years, she insisted that Nathaniel wear dresses around the house and play with dolls. She claimed it would teach him patience and gentleness. Harold rarely questioned his wife's decisions. He worked long hours as a mechanic and preferred to avoid arguments at home. Despite the bizarre upbringing, Nathaniel grew into an exceptionally intelligent child. He learned to read earlier than most children his age. Teachers quickly noticed his remarkable memory. He could name stars and constellations after reading about them only once. By the time he reached middle school, he had already skipped 2 grades. Music became another one of his talents. At 9 years old, Nathaniel began playing the piano with remarkable skill. He practiced constantly, often losing himself in complicated classical pieces for hours. His performances at local school events impressed teachers and neighbors alike. To many people, Nathaniel Carter appeared to be a gifted young boy with a bright future. But there was another hobby he developed that few people fully understood. It began with animals. Evelyn Carter had a fascination with taxidermy, the process of preserving animal bodies so they appear lifelike. She introduced Nathaniel to it when he was still very young. For his 10th birthday, she bought him his first rifle. Together, mother and son would walk through the wooded areas outside Redstone, searching for small animals, rabbits, squirrels, birds. When they returned home, Evelyn taught Nathaniel how to prepare the bodies. She showed him how to carefully remove the skulls, how to clean the skin, how to use small knives and metal tools to remove delicate organs without damaging the outer shape. Nathaniel became obsessed with perfecting the process. He wanted every animal to look exactly as it had in life. But the part he found most fascinating was the final step, the eyes. Real eyes decayed too quickly, so taxidermists used artificial glass ones instead. Nathaniel would visit a small supply shop in town that carried dozens of these glass eyes in every possible color and size. He loved staring at them. Rows of shining, lifelike eyes looked back at him inside their display boxes. Brown, blue, green, amber. Some belonged to birds, others to deer or foxes. Nathaniel once told the shop owner that he wished he could collect them like other boys collected marbles. The man laughed, assuming it was just childish curiosity. But Nathaniel wasn't joking. Even with his intelligence, trouble followed Nathaniel as he grew older. At just 13 years old, he was caught stealing small items from local stores. Soon afterward, he became involved in a fight that left another boy seriously injured. Police charged him with petty theft and assault. The incidents shocked his teachers. How could a boy so bright behave so recklessly? Despite the trouble, Nathaniel continued excelling academically. By 15, he graduated from high school early and enrolled at Midwestern State College, where he planned to study pre-med. He told everyone he wanted to become a doctor. But the same pattern followed him again. During his first year at college, campus police discovered Nathaniel carrying stolen money along with several illegal firearms in his car. The charges led to his arrest and a short jail sentence. His dream of becoming a doctor ended almost immediately. After his release, Nathaniel attempted to rebuild his life by enrolling at another school in Arkansas, once again studying pre-med. But history repeated itself. He was caught stealing equipment from the campus laboratory and expelled before finishing his program. Still convinced he deserved success, Nathaniel created something shocking. He forged his own university degrees. Using stolen documents and carefully imitated signatures, he produced fake bachelor's and master's diplomas that looked almost identical to legitimate ones. With those false credentials, he managed to secure a job teaching science at a small high school. For a short time, his life appeared stable. He even married a young woman he had met during college, and the couple eventually had a daughter together. But Nathaniel's lies could not remain hidden forever. When school administrators discovered that his academic records were fraudulent, he was fired and placed on probation. The stress destroyed his marriage. By 1965, his wife had separated from him. Their divorce would become official several years later. Nathaniel Carter drifted through a series of odd jobs after that. He spent brief periods in jail for theft and fraud. He struggled to maintain steady employment, yet strangely, many people still found him charming. He was intelligent, well-spoken, and capable of holding long conversations about art, science, or music. Those who didn't know his past often trusted him quickly. In the late 1970s, he settled in a quiet neighborhood outside Dallas, Texas, where he eventually befriended several of his neighbors. Some even trusted him enough to let him babysit their children. But in 1981, that trust collapsed when Nathaniel was accused of molesting a 14-year-old who lived nearby. He pleaded guilty and received probation. Later, he insisted he had only admitted guilt to avoid a lengthy legal battle. Few people believed him. By the mid-1980s, Nathaniel's life seemed to change once again. While traveling through Arkansas, he met a quiet widow named Margaret or Maggie Lawson. Maggie was shy, kind, and deeply lonely after the death of her husband. Nathaniel charmed her immediately. He took her to elegant restaurants, played piano for her in the evenings, and told stories about art, science, and the stars. Maggie believed she had finally found someone who truly understood her. Within a year, she moved into Nathaniel's home. Maggie supported him financially, paying the household bills while he worked a simple job delivering newspapers in the early morning hours. She believed he was rebuilding his life. But Nathaniel had another reason for those late-night deliveries. The job allowed him to travel through the darkest streets of Dallas unnoticed. And somewhere in those streets, a violent obsession he had carried since childhood was beginning to return. Soon, 3 women would be found murdered, and the killer responsible would leave behind a signature so disturbing that detectives would struggle to understand it. Because when the victims were discovered, their eyes were gone. By the late 1980s, Nathaniel Carter had built a life that looked quiet and respectable from the outside. He lived in a small house on the southern edge of Ridgeway, Texas, and spent his mornings delivering newspapers before most of the city had even woken up. To his neighbors, Nathaniel was simply the polite man who drove through the neighborhood before sunrise, tossing folded papers onto driveways. Some even described him as thoughtful. He often helped older residents carry groceries or stopped to talk about gardening and wildlife. Inside the house, however, a different side of Nathaniel lived quietly beneath the surface. His longtime girlfriend, Margaret Lawson, paid most of the household expenses. She believed Nathaniel was working hard to rebuild his life after the mistakes of his past. She trusted him completely. But those early morning newspaper routes gave Nathaniel something else. They gave him access to the darkest corners of the city, places where very few people paid attention to strangers driving slowly through the night. And it was in those quiet streets that Nathaniel began spending time around the Red Lantern Motel, a rundown building known locally as a place where sex workers often stayed. Nathaniel had visited the area many times before. At first, he simply watched from inside his car, observing the women who worked the sidewalks nearby. Some nights he spoke with them briefly, offering rides or small amounts of money. Over time, several of the women began recognizing him. One of them was Laura Bennett, a 32-year-old woman who had been working the streets around the motel for years. She knew most of the regular clients and often warned the younger women about men who seemed dangerous. Nathaniel didn't seem dangerous. He spoke softly and treated her politely, something she wasn't used to. But Laura never knew how closely Nathaniel watched her. On a cold evening in November 1990, Laura Bennett was seen leaving the Red Lantern Motel with a man driving a dark sedan. Witnesses later described the driver as an older man with glasses and gray hair. 2 days later, Laura's body was discovered on an empty stretch of road just outside the city limits. A truck driver spotted her lying near a drainage ditch and immediately contacted the police. When officers arrived, they quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Laura had been beaten severely before she died. Her clothing had been partially removed, and her body showed signs of a violent struggle. But the most disturbing detail wasn't visible until the medical examiner arrived at the scene. Laura's eyes were closed. When investigators later opened them during the autopsy, they made a horrifying discovery. Both eyeballs were missing. They had been removed with shocking precision. There was almost no tearing of tissue, no jagged cuts, nothing that suggested a clumsy or hurried attack. Whoever had done it had used careful, deliberate technique. Detective Martin Caldwell, one of Ridgway's most experienced homicide investigators, was assigned the case. He had worked many violent crimes during his career, but even he found the details unsettling. Removing a victim's eyes was something he had never seen before. At first, police assumed the murder might be connected to Laura's work as a sex worker. Violence against prostitutes unfortunately wasn't uncommon, and many of those crimes went unsolved. But something about this case felt different. The removal of the eyes suggested an obsession, and obsessions rarely ended with only one victim. 2 months later, Detective Caldwell's fears proved correct. Another woman named Sandra Lopez was found dead on the same isolated road where Laura's body had been discovered. Sandra was younger, only 26 years old, and had also been working near the Red Lantern Motel. The crime scene looked hauntingly familiar. Sandra's clothing had been partially removed, she had been shot in the head, and her body had been carefully placed in the same position as Laura's. When the medical examiner examined her eyes, the result was exactly what Caldwell expected. They were gone, removed with the same strange precision. The realization hit the investigators immediately. They were dealing with a serial killer. Unfortunately, the investigation faced major obstacles. Both women had been picked up somewhere else and dumped at the roadside location. That meant the actual murders had likely happened somewhere completely different. Detectives searched for witnesses, questioned motel employees, and interviewed dozens of sex workers who operated in the area. Many were reluctant to talk to police, fearing arrest or retaliation. Still, a few pieces of information began to emerge. Several women mentioned a quiet older man who occasionally drove through the neighborhood late at night. He was known for being polite and soft-spoken, but he sometimes asked unusual questions. One woman remembered him asking about people's eyes. At the time, she assumed he was joking. Now the comment seemed chilling. Detectives began searching through police records for anyone with a history of violence who lived nearby. That's when the name Nathaniel Carter appeared. His record showed years of theft, fraud, and disturbing allegations. He had once been arrested for molesting a teenage girl, though he had received only probation. More importantly, a woman who worked near the Red Lantern Motel told investigators that Laura Bennett knew Nathaniel personally. She had seen them talking several times. That connection was enough for Detective Caldwell to begin looking deeper into Nathaniel's life. The breakthrough came in March 1991. Early one morning, a third body was discovered near an elementary school just a few miles from the Red Lantern Motel. The victim was Denise Harper, another woman who had been working the streets nearby. The discovery horrified the community. Children walking to school had seen the body lying near the curb before police arrived to secure the area. Detective Caldwell rushed to the scene. He didn't even need the medical examiner to confirm what he already suspected. When investigators checked Denise Harper's face, they found the same horrifying detail. Her eyes were removed, but this time the killer had made a mistake. During the autopsy, the medical examiner discovered something lodged deep inside one of Denise's eye sockets, a broken piece of an X-Acto blade. It was the first real physical evidence investigators had recovered from any of the murders. The killer had likely been in a hurry when removing the eyes and accidentally snapped the blade. For Detective Caldwell, it was the clue he had been waiting for. Because someone obsessed with precision tools, cutting instruments, and careful detail might also have a history connected to those interests. And when Caldwell reviewed Nathaniel's past once again, something disturbing stood out. Nathaniel had spent his childhood practicing taxidermy. He had been trained to remove animal eyes with surgical care. Suddenly, the pieces began to fall into place. Detectives now had a strong suspect. All they needed was the evidence to prove it. And that evidence might be waiting inside Nathaniel's house. By the spring of 1991, Detective Martin Caldwell and his team were convinced they had finally identified the man responsible for the disturbing series of murders that had terrified Ridgway, Texas. 3 women had been killed. 3 bodies had been found with their eyes removed. And all the evidence was slowly pointing toward one suspect, Nathaniel Carter. At first, the connection seemed thin. Carter had never been charged with murder before, and there were no witnesses who could place him directly at the crime scenes. But as investigators began speaking with women who worked around the Red Lantern Motel, a pattern began to appear. Several prostitutes remembered Carter. They described him as an older man who drove through the area late at night. He often tried to start quiet conversations before asking strange questions. One woman later told police that Carter once admitted he had always been fascinated by human eyes. At the time, she assumed he was simply making awkward conversation. Now it sounded like something far more disturbing. Another woman told detectives that Carter had become aggressive with her during a meeting and had tried to force her into his car. She managed to escape before anything worse happened. With multiple women connecting Carter to the area where the victims had worked, investigators finally had enough to request a search warrant for his home. When detectives arrived at Carter's house early one morning, he appeared calm and cooperative. He allowed the officers inside without resistance. But as they began searching the property, the atmosphere inside the home quickly changed. In the bedroom, detectives discovered a .44 caliber revolver along with several X-Acto knives stored neatly inside a drawer. The knives were similar to the type that could have been used to remove the victim's eyes. Nearby, officers found a red-stained condom and several pieces of disturbing reading material, including books about famous serial killers and violent crimes. But the most unsettling discoveries were scattered throughout the house. Detectives found several old dolls placed on shelves in Carter's bedroom. Each one had something strange about it. Their eyes were missing. Some had empty sockets, others had small holes where the glass eyes had been removed. To the investigators already familiar with the crime scene details, the symbolism was impossible to ignore. It looked less like a coincidence and more like an obsession. Despite the disturbing evidence, the revolver found inside the house did not match the bullets recovered from the victims. That meant the murder weapon was still missing. For a moment, it seemed like the investigation might stall again. Then the forensic team made another discovery. Inside Carter's bedroom, investigators collected several strands of hair found on his blankets and inside his vacuum cleaner. The hairs were sent to a laboratory for microscopic comparison with samples taken from the victims. Several days later, the results came back. The hairs found inside Carter's home were consistent with those of Denise Harper, the third and most recent victim. It was the strongest physical evidence investigators had gathered so far. Based on that finding, police placed Nathaniel Carter under arrest. The quiet newspaper delivery driver was now the prime suspect in one of the most disturbing murder cases the city had ever seen. The trial began later that year, in December 1991. By then, newspapers had already given the case a chilling nickname. They called Carter the Eye Collector. The courtroom filled with reporters, curious residents, and family members of the victims. Everyone wanted to hear the evidence that would reveal whether Carter truly was the man responsible. The prosecution faced a difficult challenge. Unlike many murder cases, there was no direct witness, no confession, no murder weapon linking Carter to the crimes. Instead, the case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and forensic testimony. Prosecutors presented the jury with Carter's long criminal history. They described his childhood fascination with taxidermy and his obsession with collecting artificial eyes. They showed photographs of the dolls found in his home. They also presented the hair evidence that connected him to Denise Harper. Several sex workers testified that Carter had approached them in the same area where the victims had worked. Some described feeling uncomfortable around him, while others recalled his strange interest in discussing eyes. The prosecution argued that Carter had developed a disturbing obsession that eventually turned deadly. The defense team responded aggressively. They argued that the evidence against Carter was weak and largely based on speculation. The hair analysis, they said, was not precise enough to prove he had killed anyone. They also reminded the jury that Carter had been charged with 3 murders, but the prosecution had struggled to prove he committed even one of them beyond doubt. Carter himself remained calm throughout the trial. When reporters asked him about the accusations, he insisted that he was innocent and that the police had misunderstood the evidence. He admitted that he had met some of the women in the past, but denied ever harming them. "I didn't kill anyone," he told the court. But the jury had heard weeks of disturbing testimony, and in the end, they reached a decision. After several hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Nathaniel Carter was found guilty of the murder of Denise Harper, the third and most recent victim. However, the evidence connecting him to the other two killings was considered too uncertain for additional convictions. Even so, the guilty verdict meant Carter would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment. As the sentence was announced, Carter showed almost no emotion. He simply stared ahead as officers led him out of the courtroom. For the families of the victims, the verdict brought a small sense of closure, but many questions still remained. Had Carter really killed all three women? Or had investigators only uncovered part of a larger and more complicated truth? Nathaniel Carter spent the rest of his life in a high-security psychiatric prison unit, where doctors closely monitored his behavior. According to several prison staff members, he remained fascinated by the same strange subject that had followed him since childhood: eyes. He reportedly spent hours discussing vision, anatomy, and the structure of the human eye with anyone willing to listen. Nathaniel Carter died in prison at the age of 87. Even after his death, the mystery surrounding the Ridgway murders never fully disappeared. Some investigators remained convinced he was responsible for all three killings. Others believed there was never enough evidence to prove it. But one detail was impossible to ignore. Every victim had been found with their eyes removed. And throughout his life, Nathaniel Carter had never stopped talking about them. Which leaves one final question that investigators and true crime researchers still debate today. Was Nathaniel Carter truly the eye collector? Or was the real killer someone who was never caught?